My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm the co-owner and managing director with Impetus Digital. For those of you who don't know who our company is or what we do, our company has built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous collaboration tools, and we built this all into the Impetus Insight platform. And we've been leveraging this platform with life sciences companies from across the globe over the past 11 years to do things like advisory boards, virtual investigator meetings, co-author groups, and also since the COVID-19 pandemic, we've had a lot of people needing to virtualize their in-person meetings, their brand planning sessions, their POA rollouts, etc. In light of the fact that a lot of conferences and subsequent advisory board meetings have gone virtual, we've seen a whole bolus of people needing those meetings changed as well. At Impetus, we actually believe that everything starts with a thought and a really great, courageous conversation. So we don't think that any great big ideas, disruptive, positive ideas and impact on healthcare can start without these kinds of conversations. And so we really believe at Impetus that our portal acts like the bridge or the opportunity for us to start those conversations and then to sustain and build them so that we can help to foster some of these big, hairy, audacious, provocative things that we all want to see in healthcare so we can get things bigger, better, and faster to patients all around. So this is one of these conversations. So the whole point behind this webinar series is so that we can have these types of conversations with people like Tom and others so we can start dissecting and picking apart and investigating some of these novel ways of doing and thinking things through. And so we're really happy to be able to have Tom Hsu here in the meeting with us. So very, very happy to have you. Thank you.
Hello, Natalie.
Awesome. So Tom Hsu is a health and business professional. He comes with a special interest in the well-being of people, which is so awesome in a really great leader, and in the business of healthcare. He's worked in a variety of different roles in medical affairs. He's actually worked in marketing, so he does have that good, keen sense of business as well. He's been in sales and strategy, and he's currently the Vice President of Specialty Medicine at Bayer, Canada. And he oversees the specialty medicine portfolio, which includes oncology, hematology, ophthalmology, and pulmonary hypertension. He also contributes over 50% of the revenue and most of the growth for Bayer Canada. So a big job. Also a little bit about Bayer. I know that we've all heard of it. It's been a very iconic company for many, many years in Canada and obviously globally as well. In this age of rapid change, Bayer strives to deliver the world's best solutions to global challenges in the fields of health and nutrition. And with a life expectancy continuing to rise and the need to improve the quality of life for a growing population, they're planning to focus on the research and development activities on preventing, alleviating, and treating diseases. They're also trying to make really important contributions by providing reliable supplies of high-quality food, feed, and plant-based raw materials. So in Canada, Bayer has over 1,300 passionate and innovative employees. And as a life science company, they actually have 3 core divisions. They work in pharmaceuticals, consumer health, and crop science. So they hit kind of all those 3 big pillars. They're committed to operating sustainably and addressing social and ethical responsibilities, and they continue to shape our industry as a whole. And their efforts are catalyzed by focusing on the customer. So they always have a customer-centric approach, and the patient is always their primary focus. So this, of course, contributes to Bayer's vision of health for all and hunger for none. So a beautiful, beautiful way to start our meeting. So welcome, Tom. So happy to have you. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. Maybe what we can actually just do is, since you are a healthcare leader, not only at Bayer, but within Canada, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your professional journey. There might be a lot of people here who may one day want to be a VP of specialty medicine. So how did you get to where you got to today?
Hi, good morning, Natalie. Thank you, first of all, for having me on your channel, and thank you for um, getting me into a proper shirt this morning because I've been on video calls for the last couple of weeks. We've all been working from home. So thank you for getting me out of my usual t-shirt and sweatshirts on a daily basis. Um, I got into the business of healthcare because I actually went to school to be a pharmacist. I've always been interested in science, um, in the treatment of people, and I studied pharmaceuticals at University of Toronto to start out. And actually, I was a practicing pharmacist in a hospital for quite some time. During that time, uh, as a practicing pharmacist, I got familiar with the pharmaceutical industry and became quite interested. Sort of the global nature of a company, the breadth of sort of the treatments that were available. So then fairly early in my career, I tracked over to pharmaceuticals, started in medical affairs, because usually pharmacists start at big pharmaceutical companies in medical affairs. It was with a company called AstraZeneca at the time. And through several other kind of moves throughout my career, I branched out from medical affairs to sales, and then to marketing, and then to business. Along the way, I picked up an MBA, and then went abroad and managed a marketing team for Bear China. About 5 years ago, I came back to Canada. I'm Canadian, and I wanted to return home and to take over my current position as Vice President of Specialty for Canada.
Wow. I do have to ask you, I mean, in light of all that is going on, this is kind of a sidebar conversation. What was some of the big differences that you noticed having come back from the Chinese market and Canada? And I guess that was obviously pre-COVID, but post-COVID, I mean, do you have any insights to share with the group about what you saw as being some of the core differences in practice of how a pharmaceutical company does work, but compared to what you were doing in China? I think it's kind of a relevant conversation based on a lot of the things that are going on with the trade wars right now with the US. I was just curious if you noticed any major differences in how we manage pharmaceutical companies.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In China, just first of all, the scale is much more different, right? Just because of the population size and the size of business in China, our presence is actually just on the pharmaceutical China in China is about 5,000 people. 10,000 when you include all of Bear. So in Bear Canada, as you had already alluded to, we have about 1,300 people. So it's about 10 times as big. So your teams are much bigger and you're spread over multiple geographies. So that's just one key difference. And China is usually a very important market for most pharmaceutical companies. For Bayer, it's actually our number one pharmaceutical market right now. The second difference is pace. It's just when I was there, which was between 2010 and 2015, there was a lot of economic growth. There was a lot of infrastructure building. There was a lot of evolution in business practices. So everything was happening at, what I would call what I always refer to as dog years, right? Like 1 year of life was like 7 years, right? So like everything was like accelerated. So like it seems like everything you did traditionally over a longer period of time was just compressed. And decision making and being able to be nimble was really a differentiator.
Yeah.
Lastly, it's really, and this is some of the things I appreciate more about Canada. I mean, sometimes it's frustrating too. It's transparency about regulations, right? In China, there's not as much transparency in how you operate, and things are much more unpredictable. So you just have to be ready for almost a lot of quick changes. Things could be very, very slow and then evolve very quickly, right? So just the examples would be their regulatory rules, right? They've had a long history of very rigid regulatory rules on how you bring products to market. You had to do a certain amount of Chinese trials. It was very rigid, and then all of a sudden, like over a period of like 2 or 3 months, everything changed. So it's that kind of quick change in pace that you had to be used to, and then you kind of when I came back to Canada, it was like, oh, okay, it's nice to have actually a clear set of rules to follow.
So it is really interesting that the pharmaceutical business that you came from is really like a fractal or a reflection of their overall economy. I've heard as well too is that they've accelerated growth and we're able to propel 720 million people from poverty. I mean, in literally a few decades. So I think it's a reflection of that. So I just wanted to sidebar that because I just think it's very timely based on a lot of what's going on in the world today. I had a chance, obviously have seen you at the Ontario Pharmaceutical Marketing Association meetings, but recently heard you speaking there and was really impressed with, and that was actually during, one of the post-COVID meetings that we had to do virtually. And thought it was really interesting, some of the things that you were talking about. And obviously one of the key things that a lot of people are reflecting on is around communication. And communication has changed dramatically since this time. And I wanted to kind of linger on this concept a little bit with you more about how have you found internal communication really changed for you and your teams?
Well, I mean, first, we had the technology, the video technology, but we really didn't use it, right? So as a company, when we need to get everybody together, we had large national meetings and brought everybody usually to one place. Even though we had people spread over across the country, everyone would fly to one place and we would communicate our strategies and our outlook and our updates to the broad audience all in one place. When we make key decisions, people met in boardrooms, talked through the issues, met, workshopped, made decisions all in kind of face to face, right? So we were very, and of course, as teams, you either had one-on-ones. It was a very face to face culture, and typically, even if you had somebody remote, it was 8 people in a room on live and one person on the phone that had to be remote and listening in, and they sometimes got ignored. So that's it. So very typical. I think that's very typical of most corporate cultures, right? Up until March of 2020. Starting March 2020, everything changed. So everybody got familiar and had to very quickly learn technology such as Zoom and Teams, and then other platforms to be able to communicate through video, right? And that has been a big change for us. And luckily, the technology had actually had progressed beyond our own behavior. But it's like I can't imagine if we had to do this back in the early 2020s and had to communicate all the time through BlackBerry, right? Our thumbs would be really sore by now. But thank God that the technology had evolved and we're able to use it. So even my own personal learnings is I've evolved. I've gotten better at learning teams. I've gotten more familiar and used to communicating in this way. And we actually quite realized that you can actually be effective communicating in this manner.
So when you compare the two, the face-to-face, so again, this is actually something, as you know, what Impetus has been doing for the last 11 years, and just like telemedicine, it's suddenly, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, a lot of people have been looking to using these virtual platforms. Now, there's pros and cons to all of them. And, and there's obviously some distinctive differences. For example, when we've done in-person, even advisory boards versus doing them virtually. So can you compare and contrast about what you think doesn't quite do the same things? And what do you think are some of the really, the added benefits that we didn't necessarily have when you were actually meeting people in person?
Yeah, so I'll go into one of the downsides. It's really people that don't have familiarity are running into this. So these are new employees, new customer relationships where previously you may not have a an established relationship, right? So those are the kind of things we missed, and it really kind of grounds down to the issue of trust, right? So there's been a lot of research done on work teams, right? And people that are experts on work teams know that having a trust is actually a path, a differentiator for effective work teams, right? So there's been many studies that the levels of trust equals high productivity in work. So that familiarity when you're in the room face to face is lost through video, right? So you miss visual cues. You miss sort of like little nuances, right? You miss some of the banter, the banter and familiarity you get from coffee time chats, running into each other in the elevator. So those opportunities are lost. Now, you have some of those with people that you have long-term established trust with, but really the challenge is if you don't have that, especially with, say, new employees and coming into a new organization, or a customer salesperson relationship where you're trying to build a relationship, a lot of that is built over face-to-face, and those are the kind of key things that we will miss as employees, as colleagues, as salespeople to customers, and also to leaders and employees.
I think it's actually such a great point. The trustability fee, I've kind of come to that same conclusion, because we basically can get some of these visual cues, the same sort of stuff that we would. The only thing that we're not getting is the pheromone cue, which most of us don't need for business. But what's interesting here, I think, at the end of the day, when I really analyze what the key missing piece is, the part of what we call watching somebody when they're not aware. And that's actually what you can actually get when you're having dinner with somebody or you're having a coffee with them, is you're watching things like, did they tip the waitress? Or did they start swearing out of nowhere? Those kind of nuances that you can't, when you're not really aware, that you have an opportunity to technically surveil somebody. And, we deal a lot, with investors and other sorts of people, and it's a challenge for them because this is part of their evaluation process. So it's learning to find new ways. And I don't know if your company has indulged in any of those kind of fun activities to try to instill some of that laid back kind of watching people when they're not kind of watching. Have you done any of those coffee chats, or is that just not something that you were able to do with your teams?
Yeah, we do. I think most teams have adopted those, some sort of informal social gatherings. Either it's the Friday afternoon drinks together, or it's the coffee time. I know certain teams have a lot of coffee times, or even with my team, we've had a Friday afternoon beach party. So those are kind of fun activities to have. I still would say, though, they're probably better in face-to-face, but we're trying to you make the best of it, right? And as probably technologies evolve, maybe those are kind of things that will get better. But right now, we're kind of evolving into that stage. Everyone's kind of trying something different, new, but you're absolutely right, right? So having those kind of sort of connecting activities is super important. Just like when you enter a meeting, if it's face-to-face, you usually have some banter to start with. I think that's important to have even when you do video cons, right? We've actually learned on that. I think when I started meetings and just started right into the agenda, you kind of don't have the same level of effectiveness as you kind of have a little banter and then ease into those agenda topics.
So it's fun actually that you're talking about really developing new virtual synchronous virtual like etiquette. Like it's like learning a new skill. It's like, learning to go surfing. It's a new skill, and that requires time to kind of get used to it and figure out where everybody fits in. The other thing that I've actually was curious as well too is sometimes these meetings can be very energy depleting in a different way than live meetings are. We found a lot of times when we were doing live advisory boards, for example, there were energy dissipators, like things like being able to go to the bathroom, or, chatting with somebody outside, or, grabbing something to eat or whatever. We don't really have that here. And so it's a little bit more energy depleting. Have you built in some rules with your teams about what makes sense to have these meetings, who should be in them, and what sort of asynchronous tools might be a better approach for communication? Have you sort of set up some of those riverbanks or kind of not regulations, but processes for people to consider?
Absolutely. So that's actually super important. I'm happy you brought that point up. Uh, Having team norms is super important because so when we first started working this way, I would say I was probably doing 8 to 9 hour days on video back to back, and you're absolutely right. Just like I would say, I would after the day, I would talk to my wife and say, "Geez, I'm actually really tired," but I didn't have to drive, right? I didn't have all the usual kind of hassles with going into the office, but yet I'm super exhausted right now, and so we actually had to, as a Bayer pharmaceutical team, put in place some guidelines. It's not rigid, but some general guidelines on team norms on conducting virtual meetings and how to communicate during this time. So one of the things that you talked about is really important. Like sometimes for certain issues, um, a sort of a chat thread or email is totally fine, right? You don't have to have a team or video conference for everything. Also, learning to put breaks in place in like, so we kind of have a rule like 90 minutes is the most you go without a break, and then at 90 minutes, you put a pop song on or some sort of iTunes or Amazon Music tunes on, and everybody takes a little musical interlude for about 10-15 minutes. Meetings shouldn't go longer than 3 hours, at a time, right, during the day. And you shouldn't try to book more than say 4 to 6 hours of video meetings throughout the period of the day. Although I have to admit, sometimes we break these rules. We do meetings longer than 3 hours, but we try to abide by those most of the time. And we found that through those kind of norms, we were able to navigate our day more efficiently and not end up so exhausted.
Very
And
interesting.
I also hear some people are going for like virtual walks together, and like people are on their phones, but they're walking at the same time. So those are kind of things that can be done.
Yeah, I think those are really, really great ideas. You and I were kind of bantering a little bit before the start of this call. And I know that people are, going to be hearing this from all over the world, but many people are probably here from Ontario as well. Is, as you know, we really don't know when we're going to be technically getting out of lockdown. I think many of us are a little distressed by the fact that we were hoping to hear some good news because this happens every 2 weeks. And we don't even really know if the end of June is even going to be feasible. So there is this possibility that we have to sort of do things in a more sustained way. Have you given it any thought on how to continue to build momentum, manage culture, and do all these other things in a little bit more sustained way digitally? I was just curious, is this going to be a new norm?
It's going to be We're going to be operating this way for some time, right? I don't think we're going to ever go back to the way it was. I hate to be the bearer of kind of news because I think everybody's really optimistic and hoping to kind of go back to the time where we could have large gatherings and watch sports in a large stadium or go to concerts or be able to connect and get to go to barbecues. Um, but some research has been done recently, and it's these researchers from Harvard did a lot of modeling about the COVID-19 virus and and looked at the effectiveness of different cost containment measures, and their conclusion through this kind of deterministic modeling was that some form of strict or intermittent social distancing measures will be needed till 2022 for this to be effective. Now, whether we have the social and political will to continue this for 2 years, maybe not, but we have to kind of get ready that some measures will be in place, right? So, as an organization, one of the things that you may need to kind of do with your teams is actually at least set the expectation, right? First and foremost, like, this is not a temporary measure that's going to be over in 1 or 2 months or as of July 1st. The communication you'll need to give is we're kind of in the long haul. it might get a little better. And even if we do go back to the office, it will not be everybody goes back to the office, right? It'll be only certain people that need to be there. It could be phased. And this method of communication, virtual, through other platforms, asynchronous or synchronous, is here to stay and may be the predominant platform that we use to communicate.
So you started a little earlier saying that traditionally, prior to all of this, the traditional model of meeting was most people were in person, and then you had the oddball who was calling in, and most of the time they were ignored.
Mm.
So in the new norm, do you see this as being a choice on the employees level, or something that would be mandated from the home office of how and when and who should be picking what venue that they're choosing? Is this going to be a choice? And the other question that is associated with that is, when people decide or are asked to come back to the actual physical office, for those people who are asked to do that, what is that structure going to look like? What is the formulation and seating arrangement and the precautions? And what could you paint the picture for somebody about what it could look like at Bayer, but again, for any organization?
Yeah, so exact how it looks like, we're still kind of revolving on that. We're still trying to figure that out. So this is what we kind of do know, right? So if these measures are in place for some time, the health and safety of our employees is first and foremost. So we have to follow the social distancing sort of guide, or the public health guidelines of the jurisdictions each one of those employees resides in or works in, right? Because we have employees across the country. Another sort of known fact is every geographical region may progress at different speeds, right? So one jurisdiction that's more rurally populated, whose COVID numbers are actually plateauing and coming down, may open up before areas that are kind of have hotspots. So we have to be able to accommodate and be flexible to adjust across the country to different geographical measures. The it won't be, as you said, will it be a choice? It won't be a choice. It will be guidelines on what makes the most sense, right? So when people, as we've already put in a lot of thoughts on how people come back to the office, and it will be a phased approach, right? But it will first start with people that need to be there and have need to have access to either a server or equipment. They need to come in, so they'll be prioritized. The second basket would be people that may not have sort of the infrastructure to be able to work from home, right? For either sort of mental health reasons, efficiency reasons, they don't have the optimal home setup. So those people if requested, will be granted access. And then last and foremost, those people that are well set up at home, like myself, who have the sort of technology, who have like dedicated space, then if we can work remotely, then we should work remotely, right? So that's kind of like the guidelines that we put in place, and I think most organizations are doing that.
Yeah, no, and it totally makes sense. I'm actually just curious if any thought has gone into some of these more high risk areas like the cafeterias or where food preparation is being made. Do employees see the day where they're going to have to just bring their own food? What is the concerns or the phase-in plans around things like that?
Yeah, I actually don't have knowledge on, to be honest, I don't think we thought it through that far. I think right now we're still at the stages of working out what kind of, if we are asking employees to say go back to work or go back to working in hospitals or doctors' clinics, because that's what our field employees do. What kind of measures we need to take in place to protect them in terms of PPE equipment, rules of contact tracing. So we're still more at that stage than looking at our cafeteria. But I think a lot of people would be brown bagging it. If I was going to guess, it would be depend on the brown bag and not the cafeteria if you come back to the office.
So just switching gears a little bit, I mean, through all of these changes, there's been a huge uptake of telemedicine. I think in some numbers we've seen like a 56% increase, if not even higher. And as we both know, the Impetus Insight platform, for example, has been around for 10 or 11 years. It's the same as telemedicine, but it's just been this huge influx in usage just because there hasn't been any other choices. So with that said, physicians are seeing many of their patients, online. A lot of them are requesting and being very cautious about who they're bringing into their offices, if they're even at the office themselves. How is that affecting the current pharma business model, where the core premise behind the success of a pharma business model has been in its field representatives? How do you see this changing and evolving, either in the short, medium, and maybe long term?
That's a incredibly important question for pharma to address. First, I'll talk a little bit about the trend, right, towards telemedicine, because the key theme there is this is a industry-changing event that will have long-lasting implications going forward, right? Similar to what 9/11 did for the airline industry, similar to what the 28 credit crisis did to the financial industry, right? It's like the COVID-19 pandemic will have a long-lasting impact to a lot of different industries, but in particular healthcare. And similar to your platform, Natalie, which you've been doing for quite some time, telemedicine has actually been around, for quite some time. The technology has been there, right? And there are companies that were able to provide it. There are healthcare systems in the U.S. that actually are predominantly telemedicine delivered in terms of their healthcare, right? Kaiser Permanente, which has about 10 million patients within their health system, actually does most of their medicine delivery through telemedicine. So it's nothing new, but what the pandemic has done is just accelerated everything in terms of adoption. So you said that telemedicine is actually a trend that's been heavily adopted, and that those are facts, right? So prior to March 14th, in Canada, 90% of healthcare between HCPs and patients were delivered face-to-face, right? 10%, less than 10% was through other means. We know from data from April that now as much as 60% is being delivered through virtual means, other than face-to-face, either through text, telephone, email, or virtual platforms. So the adoption has really accelerated. Along with that, a lot of regulatory hurdles have been removed, right? So a lot of companies that were trying to deliver telemedicine before March of this year ran into a lot of different regulatory hurdles, technology interoperability. So a lot of those were removed because people were being encouraged to stay home and get their healthcare through virtual means. And then thirdly, the challenge with telemedicine in Canada was always reimbursement for doctors, right? So anybody that signed up for telemedicine had to pay out of pocket or had to have their employer's insurance pay for that consult. And we know that through the pandemic, reimbursers such as Ontario government has actually provided like different reimbursement fee codes and allowed for physicians to be paid for virtual consultations. So those are actually very important accelerants to sort of the trend toward telemedicine. And then we also know that once a lot of patients receive telemedicine, there's a high favorability of wanting to continue with telemedicine afterwards. So a lot of times when there's social will, then you have political change and regulatory change. So I think through this, a lot of changes will happen. And as a pharmaceutical industry, we need to adopt and align ourselves this way.
So really important and great points on that, Tom. And I'm just thinking as we start to project in the future and looking at the traditional metrics that we have used to evaluate the success of an organization. Do you see those metrics changing? I know that, you know, when we've typically had to look at certain things and the way we actually do sales and the way we get out and do medical education, I think there's an interesting tug of war here. There's a simultaneous need for globalization, i.e., if things are going to be transmitted more electronically, is there a need for local or regional impact? But at the same time, there is this request for, we're hearing it all the time, buy Canadian, go
Mhm.
local, you know, reduce your risk issues around, you know, supply chain and all that. So there's a push-pull between regionalization and globalization. How do you see this having an impact on the way you do business and potentially on long-term metrics for what is success going to look like?
Yeah, so absolutely. So um, and it's interesting you use the term push and pull, because traditionally the pharma model and how we engage physicians and other healthcare practitioners has been a push model, right? So by that, what do I mean by that? I mean, usually it's typically a salesperson goes in to talk to a healthcare provider, either a salesperson or a medical liaison or a medical education manager, and they use and that dialogue usually kind of centers around three kind of different interactions, either a patient focused dialogue around treatment choice or brand choice, or it's a service call where there's an invitation to invitation to a consultancy meeting or advisory board or a seminar or some sort of educational event, or quite simply sometimes it's just like a quick reminder on brand choice. So it's kind of like we make an appointment or we show up and we have that engagement. Because telehealth and because of the pandemic social distancing measures, that is very difficult, right? And almost impossible. The frequency reminders actually are almost 100% eliminated, right? So those kind of channels that pharma usually traditionally use to deliver sort of their engagements is gone, right? Or will be minimized to quite extent. They can still happen. A lot of the patient dialogue can be done through these virtual means, but a lot of that impact is taken away. So really what we need to do is evolve also to more a pull model. And by that I mean, we traditionally it was information was pushed to the physician, but then now we need to be able to deliver information when the physician needs to pull it, right, and have access to it, right? So what does that mean? Well, it just kind of means that patient education materials, right? If they're having an interaction with a patient about eye care, for example, then you need to be able to deliver the education materials when it's there to need it when they're needed. A lot we hear a lot through our research. A lot of patients right now are concerned about economic factors and being able to pay for medicines and access to medicines. So patient support programs being available to the physicians or the physician's office when they need it and having it convenient and being able to enroll patients quickly, super important, right? If you have a cancer patient that's newly diagnosed and they're very anxious about getting their medication, then the ability to facilitate sort of coverage and reimbursement really quickly is super important, right? Prescribing information. If a doctor's not familiar with any treatment choice and being able to deliver that prescribing information when they need it, again, is kind of the way we need to shift to. And then also certain things like data gaps, right? So there are certain therapeutic areas where in order to make a treatment choice, a doctor kind of relies on things like patient diaries, right? So hematology, we know what's really important is having a track of a patient's bleeding records. So companies are able to provide apps or tools that are able to provide those kind of records electronically, and helps the physician make good treatment choices will be very, very important. So those are kind of things that we're looking at to try and evolve our teams to kind of be able to deliver all of that, those services on demand, so to speak, as opposed to kind of trying to push it onto the physicians.
I love it, and you're really painting a beautiful picture of really some core components of point of care. And it sounds like the conversation is going to get slanted a lot more in terms of digital interoperability and making sure that these systems are easily accessible with a lot of less friction through things like electronic health records or medical records. And so it'll be very interesting to see in the months and years ahead of what that looks like. Something else that's kind of been brought to our attention recently, and I know it's very prevalent in the US and coming so in Canada, is this idea around vendor credentialing. This idea about being able to get in onto premises is not going to be very easy anymore. That any vendors, i.e. pharma reps or otherwise, trying to get into a hospital, they have to be an approved vendor, almost like getting a Nexus card. It's going to require payments. It's basically a hassle. How do you also see this impacting some of the information that you just shared? Is this going to dramatically reduce the traditional visit? And who's going to do those moving forward?
Yeah, so that's actually really very topical, because those are things, again, that's been around. Vendor credentialing has been instituted by quite a few health systems, but the measures, because of the pandemic, will be much more strict and strictly enforced, right? So if you take examples, there's some Toronto hospitals right now that have actually implemented the vendor credentialing and said, vendors, which they categorize as anybody that actually sells or provides a service to that hospital. So it could be anything from medical equipment to bed sheets or to pharmaceutical products. They put in sort of categories on all the vendors, right? So all pharmaceutical companies would be categorized as vendors. And in order to be actual to have access to the hospital, to actually get into the hospital, right? You have to kind of first be credentialed, and you actually have to state the purpose of why you're there, right? And they kind of reserve it into 3 different categories. So one, you're either there to like provide direct access to service a piece of equipment, or provide a piece of equipment, or provide a pharmaceutical a product. So that's level 1. You're there actually for treatment. Level 2 is there if you're there for education. So if you're there to kind of provide education to their staff on a piece of equipment or how to use a particular product. Those are kind of the 1 and 2 criterias that allows you to actually walk into that institution or that healthcare center. All other reasons, you don't get in. Right. So, so the traditional there that I'm here to talk to a physician or drop into a nuclear med center. So those access abilities will no longer exist, and then you as a vendor need to be actually on their vendor list to even be able to come in for reasons 1 and 2.
Mm. Yeah, so it's going to be a very interesting world, I think, moving forward. But these are all things that companies like Bayer and otherwise are considering and planning as you're planning the new business model. Now, we talked a little bit about push and pull and about some of these polarities, or sometimes these apparent contradictions, which may not be, but there's polarities to the issues, and one of them has to do with pharmaceutical companies. There may be concerns around long-term abilities for patients to pay for their medications. There's been issues around some of the clinical trials halting and then having to sort of sputter and start because of what's happened, and that might have some impact on launch dates and things for future products. Concerns again about adherence, about patients not starting prescriptions or physicians staying to mainstay. So there's this possibility of a longer term financial impact on pharma. And on the other hand, you're getting all of this fame and glory with pharma. Suddenly medicine is back on the forefront, very popular amidst, Main Street. Stocks are going through the roof. Everybody is trying to, do the rah-rah for pharma to find the next COVID-19 vaccine. do you see this polarity? And at the end of the day, how do you think this is going to net for pharma in terms of maintaining its place as an independent company? Or do you see there being mergers and acquisitions because people have to consolidate because there's going to be an overall negative impact on the life sciences space?
Well, I think the first thing is we actually have to acknowledge that a lot of pharmas come together to address the immediate pandemic issue. So a lot of resources and thinking and sort of capabilities that pharma could bring, right? Pharma is actually very good in a very good spot to be able to kind of address what are the long-term solutions for COVID-19. We at Bayer, where we've partnered with a research group out of Hamilton called PHRI to do a Canadian-driven multi-center trial on looking for treatments for COVID-19. So I think that it's nice that the research and sort of the capabilities of pharmaceutical companies to be able to help with this issue is being acknowledged, and it's as we should, because we in a time of a global price crisis, you know, the people that are able to help and come bring solutions should do that, right? So as global citizens, these are things that we're happy to do, and I'm actually proud to be part of the industry that we're able to deliver. Long term, you bring up some very good points, right? So the lifeblood of any innovative pharmaceutical company is your research and development pipeline. And we know now, because of the restrictions and maybe potentially long-term impacts on restrictions to research and clinical trial activities, will also be delayed, right? As well as governments are also at this time distracted with addressing the immediate COVID-19 and pandemic. So they're not sort of working on and actively moving along reimbursement files, access to care type of topics, right? So those kind of things have all slowed down, and our timelines for those have all actually kind of lengthened, right? So we put a lot of activities into addressing the immediate crisis, but the long-term impacts of what will happen because certain treatments not COVID related are not being reimbursed, right? We have quite a good at Bayer cancer pipeline, oncology pipeline. We're launching a couple of products into the Canadian market. So those kind of reimbursements and access to those good new technologies, part of the concern is they'll take longer. And then long term, sort of the stoppage and halt of a lot of the clinical trial activities, right? Because of restrictions to access on patients, prioritization of patients. If you're a patient and you have a disease that you're anxious about, you have COVID you're anxious about, one of the last things you may want to do is participate in a clinical trial. So being able to acknowledge that and find ways to kind of move on and further that clinical development program is going to be very important for us for long-term sustainability.
I think it brings a really great question, and I actually have a question from the audience as well too. But and I'm going to ask about. But it's really just the next piece here is really around. With all of that said, the use of technology is going to be the change agent and the accelerant, or the balancer, if you will, of all of these different. It's basically the tool that will help to align the plane back into getting it out of the air pocket. Right, it's going to get it back into alignment. Everything from clinical trials, et cetera. You know, on that note, there could be this new evolution about how you can have patients still enrolled, but maybe more from a global standpoint, by leveraging wearables, by leveraging other more resilient endpoints. Is this something that you see as being a new way of the future, so that we can, in fact, be able to leverage pharmaceutical conglomerations like the Trustability example, where pharma companies have gotten together to solve problems, and then within that framework, be able to create more resilient endpoints, more portable ways to be able to collect data? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is an area is not my expertise, I have to admit, but similar to how telehealth technology was always there, and now it's being accelerated. there are a lot of technologies that facilitate sort of accelerate research programs that are already started to be in use, like in silico modeling for research that helps uses artificial intelligence to kind of assess different treatment choices and get proof of concept quicker because of using computerized modeling as opposed to always kind of doing a lab sample. So those kind of technologies already exist, and the adoption of those technologies, similar to like telehealth, will be accelerated because you can't do the more traditional, long-term rigorous bench work or in human clinical trial bench work. You're going to have to do a lot of that work using artificial intelligence and modeling ahead of time. And also similar to what you say, a lot of times you have to gather this data potentially from wearables and real life data, instead of actually going out and doing a traditional trial with ethics approvals and things like that, which take a much longer time. Everything will need to be accelerated.
Taking this back just to the basics of day to day for people who are in the field, people who might be in marketing, one of the fundamentals is really about email. And I guess a key question for you as a leader in the company is, how do you see email working and functioning for collaborations, with communications with physicians, both at the field level and the marketing level? How do you see this working today and potentially evolving in the future?
I mean, that's a good question.
This is a question, sorry, from the audience. So sorry, I
Oh,
just wanted to mention that.
I don't know if I have a good answer for that. I think, I mean, email still exists. It's still a primary, I think it's a primary form of communication now, when you need to document almost something official. So way back when, okay, when my career started, right, the letter seemed to be like the official, and in certain industries like legal, you still need to have like a liquid ink signature, that's stamped on a letterhead for it to be official, right? So my quick answer to that is now kind of email for decisions is kind of the official channel, right? If you want to communicate, cascade an official communication about certain pandemic guidelines, we as a company will send it out by email. But all the work is usually done through chat threads, or collaborative formats such as Teams and SharePoints.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't imagine I'm an expert on this, but that's just an observation as a user.
And I think it's actually a good one. And I think really to answer the question that came in as well, or to add to what you were saying, is because email is a very structured, reportable, trackable tool, is you still have to go through all the standard ramifications of legal review, compliance reviews on what's being said. And that goes against the nimbleness of day-to-day interactions the way you would normally do just going into speaking with somebody. So the question comes down to change management. What sort of internal infrastructures, legal, compliance, protocol, process needs to potentially be modified in order to enable field people or people in general in the company to be able to in a timely and nimble way to be able to communicate with customers. So I think that the jury is out on when and how and if that is going to happen. So really quickly before we close the call, Tom, I was just curious, if you had one wish for the industry, for life sciences, for patients, I guess as we emerge from our self-quarantines and our hibernations, what would you like the world to look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think this puts this crisis is a good. I mean, it's a terrible crisis. Let's put it this way, but it's a good stimulator for positive change, right? I think it was Rahm Emanuel said during the 28 financial crisis, he had said, and he was the chief of staff for Obama at the time. He said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste," and that's something at Bear we're kind of been talking a lot about, right? Is this the optimal time to kind of like, if you're going to make a positive change for patients, what can you do in terms of delivery can this be the accelerant that helps that? So if we could look for ways, one, to deliver more effective healthcare, and to more people, that is actually really positive, right? Because we do know that one of the issues that Canadians face is long wait times to get healthcare. You know, to get a referral to an orthopedic surgeon, to even find a family doctor. If you're ill today, you may not get an appointment for like next week, right? And if you need a referral to get some sort of imaging, it might take a couple of months, right? So if Canadians and people around the world could get access to healthcare sooner through sort of these platforms, that's one going to be a positive right in then and there. The second is, traditionally, because we were limited to face-to-face, the experts you could see was constrained by your ability to travel to them. But now, if the expert for your disease is situated in Europe or in Asia, you could, now there's always regulatory hurdles, right? Because, you know, certain doctors are only licensed for certain jurisdictions, but you could share information, you could get access to consultation, you know, the access to sort of experts, it's much more broad. And we've actually started to find that, right? Like even in our activities as a company, we used to always kind of reserve the ability to invite a global speaker to talk to Canadian physicians very infrequently because they had to get on a plane and travel to Canada. But now we could actually facilitate that quite easily. So a lot of these things that I hope will stay, because it's actually a positive change for patient care and access.
I think that is a wonderful way to end this call, and it's truly brilliant. And I think it really speaks a lot to the very interesting push-pull between regionalization and the opportunities of globalization. So I am very excited. The silver lining in all of this is the unpredictableness and novelty, which, as you know, inspires dopamine drips. So interested to see what the world looks like in the future. Tom, we are very fortunate to have somebody like you as a leader at Bayer, but more importantly, in the echelons of the life sciences space in Canada. Very excited about your continued and future contributions, and love to see and hear more about what you have to say about the future of healthcare here in Canada. So thank you also to everybody who's attended today. We really appreciate your attendance. Just wanted to encourage everybody, we do these fireside chats on a regular basis. We will be sending you a recording of this wonderful webinar shortly via email. So if you have missed any of our other ones, please check out the links that are going to be in that email. You can subscribe to our e-newsletter, and you can also have access to our YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Buzzsprout podcast account. We'd love to see more and hear from all of you. Thank you again, Tom, for a wonderful conversation, and wishing everybody a wonderful day ahead.